So, William, the idea of Jesus being some kind of ransom is central to the idea or some of the traditional notions of how we're saved. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I think we have to begin clearly with the Bible and what Jesus says himself about the nature of the death of the Son of Man, and that is that he says that the Son of Man came to give himself as a ransom for many. And he also speaks of the necessity of his death. If we look at how in his ministry his disciples react to anything he says about his death, it's as if they're shutting it out. They change the subject, they don't want to know. Peter has absolutely no truck with it at all, which leads, of course, to his being told to get behind me, Satan. And right up until and including the crucifixion, where the disciples are not present, they've fallen away, they don't want to know what Jesus himself has to say about the significance of his death. It's only afterwards that they go back through the stories, and we'll talk about the resurrection later, but in the light of the resurrection can see again the significance of everything that he did and said. But those words, that the Son of Man must die to be a ransom for many, we can't get around. They are there in the heart of the Gospels, and we have to have some engagement with it.
So, in terms of the theories, if you like, of salvation based on the notion of ransom, what are the principal ones?
I think it begins with the idea of captivity. Jesus' death is within the context of a Passover, and so all the imagery around slavery and release and the new Exodus very quickly become a part of the discourse in the New Testament and in Paul's writings. Christ our Passover has been sacrificed for us, and this has its liturgical outworking almost immediately too. And let's not forget that the Passion narratives take up so much of the New Testament, particularly of each Gospel. In John's Gospel, it's nearly half of the Gospel. Yeah. So there is a constant dwelling on this, both in terms of the telling of the story and the reflection upon it, and everything is cast in its light. Paul speaks in Romans chapter 3 about, the translation is propitiation in the King James Bible, but that word has all sorts of unfortunate connotations and doesn't accurately reflect what is being spoken of. What is being spoken of is the reconciliation, the kippur, the Hebrew, of all things of the Day of Atonement, before what is translated as the mercy seat, but is better translated the place of reconciliation. Right. Everything around the Day of Atonement is not about propitiating an angry God in any way. It is about a recovery of creation. And in order to do this, we have first of all to recognise that, and it's shown so beautifully in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, that sin's immediate consequence is death. And what the reconciliation that is needed and required and expressed in Leviticus chapter 17 and then worked out on the Day of Atonement is the winding back of all things to the first day, day one, where everything in the Garden of Eden is, or even before the Garden of Eden, is perfect. It coheres. It is God's vision for the perfect creation which he is initiating. So that's what reconciliation is. And I think that's what the significance of all this reflection on Christ's death was about. What is happening? That God is initiating this act of salvation, and in which he is the protagonist. And how he takes on the suffering of the world, which is itself salvific.
Can we just go back to this notion of the angry God? Because in terms of popular culture, that's incredibly significant, isn't it? This idea of an angry God who needs some kind of payment for sin, and that the only way that payment for sin can be made is by Jesus being tortured on the cross.
Yes. Interestingly, it wasn't one of the causes of the Reformation. We didn't...
No.
It's a consequence of the Reformation that we have this doctrine. It was not something that was at issue in the debates in the Western Church. I would first of all say it's the Latin Western Church which has got itself tied up in knots over this.
Yeah.
This is not an Eastern concept
not
at
at
all.
all. No.
That doesn't mean the notion of ransom isn't in the Eastern Church, which it is. The Liturgy of St. Basil mentions it 10 times in the liturgy. So the ransom notion, that early notion of redemption from captivity, from slavery, is there. But the penal substitutionary doctrine, this is a really disgusting image of God, that he actually needs to be propitiated by the gift of his own Son.
Yes.
It causes big problems with our doctrine of the Trinity, and I think endangers our understanding of salvation, which is essentially a wonderful mystery.
Yeah. So, William, how far do you think we really need these theories or models of salvation, about how we're saved? The resurrection seemed to be enough for the disciples to convince them that things were very different.
I think it's inevitable that over 1500 years the Church was going to reflect on this, not least because its own experience, unlike our own at the moment of suffering, makes us go back to this. What is God doing? Where do we situate ourselves? How do we find ourselves connected with Christ? I think it's a natural thing to do.
So what have you taken from Sarah Bashlard's book about this?
There's something in the start of chapter 2 which I think really helps, and it's a quote from Anthony Kelly, The Resurrection Effect. It's beautiful. What is most obvious is that this past complex event, the resurrection, has left a trace or effect in our history which retires into its own uniqueness, even as it is invoked. It occurs as a summons to wager oneself on the truth of what has been revealed, to be judged by it, to enter into its field of communication, to receive its witness, even without being able to signify or ever represent it fully. And I think that characterises the ungraspable nature of the resurrection, which is this mystery which the death of Christ is the prelude to. It inevitably is going to inspire our imaginations, our prayerfulness, but it is always going to be behind a veil, beyond our reach to understand completely.
Thank you very much.